Hello, everyone. Welcome to part three of our grief series titled Cumulative Grief, Learning How to Honor the Many Losses That Occur in a Brief Period of Time. I'm Kate Vieira-Fitzer, the Metastatic Breast Cancer Program at SHARE. So good to see all of you with us today. Before the presentation begins, I'd like to tell you a little bit about SHARE. We're a national nonprofit that supports, educates, and empowers anyone diagnosed with breast or gynecological cancer and provides outreach to the general public about signs and symptoms, because no one should have to face breast, ovarian, uterine, cervical, or metastatic breast cancer alone. For more information about upcoming webinars, support groups, podcasts, and our helplines, please visit our website at sharecancersupport.org. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Kristy to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. And Kate, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. This is the third part of the three-part series. So hopefully some of you have been at the first two, and if for any reason you couldn't, no need to worry. I think you'll get something really great out of this one too. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and what that means is I have a master's degree in social work, and I have done the required training hours and taken the required exams in order to be considered a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a certified oncology social worker. What that means is I have done the required amount of hours and engagement in the world of oncology in order to have that certification. And I've been in this field for about 15 years. I am a social worker in my local cancer center, and I also have a private practice where I primarily see women who are diagnosed with cancer for ongoing therapy. I love doing workshops, speaking at conferences. I'm a big fan of trying to teach people any knowledge I have that I think could be beneficial for them. So I'm really hoping today that you walk away with some useful tools and some useful information to incorporate into your daily life. So they're probably going to take the screen down and then I will share my screen. So just bear with me a moment while I do that. All right, so today's workshop is Cumulative Grief, Learning How to Honor the Many Losses That Occur in a Brief Period of Time. Why we're all here today, I would imagine because every one of you feels some kind of connection to this idea of cumulative grief. Maybe that's because you are a person with cancer. That might be because you are a caregiver. Maybe you are a professional that's connected to this topic of cumulative grief. So we're going to talk a bit about, well, what is this exactly? And then, well, what in the world do I do with it if I'm having cumulative grief? So again, hopefully you'll walk away with some tips and tools. The goals are to define what cumulative grief is and help people here today identify some of those losses, to really acknowledge and honor the losses of your past and also the present, and to cultivate some awareness, some space and support in your grieving process. I will say that I don't have an expectation that I will be able to help everyone in the group process and make meaning of all of your losses today, because that's a very tall order. But I do hope that I introduce some ideas and tools so that you can also continue this healing process, whether that's on your own, with others, or with professionals. What I always do like to do before I begin a workshop is just take a moment to get settled, because one of the things that happens is when we're maybe in a more of a flummoxed state of mind or rushing to get somewhere or had a bit of a hectic morning, the front part of our brain, which processes a lot of this information, is just not as available to us. So having us just sit for a moment in quiet and be open and receptive to learning, growing, and healing for the next hour. If anyone is interested in just doing that, I'll be silent for a brief moment and invite you all to bring that in. Okay. So, what is cumulative grief? So, cumulative grief is also known as compounded grief, or maybe more simply, frequent grief. And it's basically grief that occurs more than once during a brief period of time. Um, the really, really important takeaway that I want everyone to know that's here today is grief does not always have to be connected to death, does not have to be connected to the physical death of another person. Grief can occur in a variety of ways. And, anyone that's on this call that has had a diagnosis of cancer or is a caregiver or is a professional that supports people, we all know that grief can be related to a variety of losses, from identity to money to legal concerns to workplace and jobs, because grief is not just related to a physical death. Grief can be related to all parts of our lives, all parts of the body, all parts of our identity. And because cumulative grief is a grief that is very frequent, most people feel very overwhelmed by their grief. And they might even feel very, very intense sorrow. And so, compounded grief, cumulative grief, frequent grief also means overwhelming grief. So the analogy that I often use is for anyone that's here that's ever been to the ocean before, right? And you walk up to the edge where the water is, and you start to see the waves out in the distance, and maybe they're quite big. Maybe you see some white caps over those waves. Some of them might kind of come crashing down, kind of towards your feet. Some of them might be a little bit more gentle and kind of slowly lap in, but they do always keep coming. And some of them are big, some of them are medium, and some of them are small. And some of them make you lose your footing a little bit or kind of jostle you around in the ocean. And some of them just kind of slowly wash over you. And that's what cumulative grief is about. It's not just these big, gigantic experiences of grief. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes it's a mixed bag of big grief, medium grief, little grief. But the frequency of it is what makes it overwhelming for people. So something really important that I also, actually, I'm going to go back for a moment. Something really important that I want to highlight is that with cumulative grief, the reason why it feels so overwhelming and compounded and frequent is because very often people are not able to have the time and space to process the first kind of wave of grief without being kind of knocked down or jostled around by the second wave or the third or the fourth or the fifth, or maybe a much higher number. But the reason it is so overwhelming is because there wasn't even space and time to process that first initial grief to begin with, or maybe that second initial grief to begin with. And so it becomes compounded and it becomes frequent and it starts to build and it starts to weigh on people. Sometimes it weighs on people in a very kind of physical sense where they have tight shoulders and tight jaw and feel ill and feel fatigued and exhausted. And sometimes it weighs on people where their mind can't concentrate. They just feel overwhelmed. There's consistency of sadness. And so that compounding and that consistent wave of grief that just won't really let up is creating that overwhelm experience, because there's really no time to get up and sit down and actually process what's really going on here. And again, what's also happening for anyone that's dealing with cumulative grief is you're still trying to live your life. So if the grief is related to the actual physical death of someone, maybe you're dealing with their estate, or you're dealing with lawyers, or you're dealing with a court system. If that grief is related to finances, finances trickle down in all areas, whether that means having to pay medical bills and that being a gigantic grief, and constant kind of loss of financial security or financial well-being. So it can also seed out into these other areas of life, because just because you're grieving doesn't mean that the rest of life is not going forward and not moving on, and that the stressors and the bills and all the things that have to happen in order for a person to function are not still simultaneously happen, even while you're feeling this tremendous grief. So really, really important. I want to highlight how cumulative grief is not necessarily what's called prolonged grief. So people that I meet with very often become very kind of scared that what they're experiencing is prolonged grief. So I'm going to go through and just identify what the differences are. It's not to say that someone with cumulative grief can't be experiencing prolonged grief, but oftentimes people are quite afraid that they are experiencing prolonged grief, but what they might actually be experiencing is cumulative grief. So grief is a natural response to the loss of someone or something that had some type of significance. And for most people, grief, it will happen. And over time, the symptoms of grief tend to dissipate a little bit more and more. So maybe that's crying and then crying a little bit less, and then eventually not crying much at all, or maybe crying on certain occasions or anniversaries. Maybe that means kind of constantly thinking about something in the beginning where you just kind of can't get it off your mind. And then as the weeks and months go by, it kind of slowly takes a little bit of more of a background seat. So that is a natural response of what happens with grief for most people. But what happens with cumulative grief is it's characterized by this frequency of having grief, but it's not necessarily meaning that it's prolonged, because in order to have prolonged grief, that requires there has to be severe disruption in your life. Now, I would imagine everyone can argue that having cumulative grief is a severe disruption to your life and your ability to function, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so prolonged grief is feeling very intense grief that consistently just keeps persisting. It never really lets up. And the symptoms become so severe that it can cause you very real problems in your life and stops you from being able to really function and do your daily life activities. And so cumulative grief, people are feeling the intensity of the grief, and there is a lot of symptoms related to grief, but it's not necessarily impeding your ability to function and, commit and complete your daily activities. Certainly for some period of time after grief occurs, people are a bit disoriented by that and they aren't able to function in the way that they used to. But as the weeks and months go on, that should eventually start to kind of resolve itself to some degree. However, in prolonged grief, there has to be a variety of things that happen in order to meet those types of requirements. And this is from the DSM, which is what mental health providers use in order to categorize if someone has some type of disorder. So it has to severely disrupt daily activities and function. That might mean not being able to get out of bed. That might mean missing work. That might mean not being able to take care of children. That might mean, not being social, not going anywhere, not doing anything, really not being able to kind of function as humans typically can. It requires an ongoing disbelief of the loss. So if we're thinking about it from a physical death perspective, it's this idea that this person did not die, and there is a real denial of this person dying. Avoiding reminders of the loss. Certainly for some people, that might mean not looking at themselves in the mirror. That might mean never going back for follow-up visits to your providers. There can be emotional numbness where it feels just like a real disconnect from your emotions, where people have said to me, like, I've never cried about this. I've never really felt any feelings about this. And we know they're there, but I'm not able to access them. And this detached and dissociated experience where it feels like you can't connect not only to yourself, but really not even to other people in any type of meaningful way. And this has to persist for at least 1 year for it to be potentially considered prolonged grief. So you have to have a pretty severe you have to meet some pretty severe requirements in order for something to be considered prolonged grief. And again, I want to highlight this because cumulative grief is not necessarily prolonged grief. It can be, but typically the prolonged grief experience, meaning it's happening and I'm grieving for a long period of time because it's so frequent, that doesn't necessarily mean it's prolonged grief in the clinical sense. It might be cumulative grief in the frequent duration and it not really letting up sense. Okay, so here's where we're going to get to like the real nuts and bolts of what we're trying to accomplish today. So a lot of times when I work with people and they bring into me the variety of losses that they're experiencing, I'll give an example. I'm working with someone right now who has had two different types of cancers diagnosed. They've had actually three types of cancers diagnosed, very different treatment for all three of them. They also have a very ill family member who is kind of very slowly in their dying process. It's also bringing up a lot of grief related to a family member who died many, many years ago. And this grief, as it relates to their diagnosis of cancer, has greatly changed their body, greatly changed their faith, greatly changed their relationships and their life, greatly changed their financial circumstances and their employment circumstances. So there's a lot of areas of grief, and they feel very overwhelmed by that grief, as they should. And part of what happens is the grief starts to kind of trickle into the conversations, and then they start to become very overwhelmed because we've just opened up, 7 different areas of grief that they might be experiencing, kind of all in this very short period of time of their life. And so they often use this, like, I just feel like I can't get out of it. It just keeps coming, one loss after the other. And so we're going to do an exercise around how people can start to organize their grief. And when I say organize, I don't necessarily mean that it goes perfectly into a nice little box with a bow and you deal with it and then you move on from it and then it just stays there. It's not typically how grief works, but it is trying to attempt to bring a little bit more order to that grief because, again, with cumulative and frequent grief, I know that people often feel very overwhelmed by it. And so when people feel very overwhelmed, I think bringing some order into the situation can be very helpful. So we're going to do our first exercise. And the first exercise is I want to remind people that we are focusing on just for today. Okay. We are only on, I believe today is June 14th, if I'm remembering correctly. We're only on June 14th. So if it feels like, well, this grief was from 3 years ago, that's fine. Bring that in today. Oh, but I forgot about the grief that happened yesterday. That's fine. It can stay where it was. This is an exercise of focusing on what's there for you today. So, what I would invite everyone to do is the first part of this exercise. So the first part is to create a list as long as you can for the next 2 minutes of all the things that you're feeling right now that you're experiencing grief over. It might be something as it relates to yourself, to your experience, to your body, to your life. It might be related to grief that you've experienced in the past, grief that you are experiencing right now in this moment on this workshop. But it's just as much grief as you want to put down on some paper or in a notepad on your iPhone, however you want to do it. I'm going to give everyone 2 minutes and you're going to list out as much grief as you can possibly list out right now. Give about 30 more seconds. Okay. So, as best as you can make your list in 2 minutes, I hope you've been able to accomplish that. If it takes longer, you're more than welcome to do this exercise after the workshop finishes. To work on any other grief that didn't, come into your mind as we're doing this. So you've created a list as long as you can for 2 minutes about all the things about grief that are on your mind today. Again, we're just here today. All we can do is accomplish what came to your mind today. Now, what I want everyone to do is I want you to review your list and I want you to pick the top 5 to 7 things that feel most intense for you today. That doesn't mean that they have not been the most intense over your life or since the grief occurred, but just for today, what are the ones that feel the most intense? So you can list 5 of them, 7 of them. If you want to do a few more, a few less, it's really up to you. I'm not going to be auditing how you do this, but list the ones that feel the most intense from your list today. And there's no wrong answer. So whatever feels like is the most intense today, that's what's in your top 5 or top 7. All right. So from that list of 5 to 7 that you've written down the most intense for today, what I now want you to do is pick out of those 5 to 7, what are the top 3? You don't have to know which one is the top 1, 2, or 3. You just have to pick what are the top 3 out of this list. So we're slowly making order of this long list, how we're going to get it smaller so that it can be more manageable to focus on today. So pick the top 3 that feel the most intense for today. And then from that list of your top 3 that feel most intense for today, I want you to pick the one that feels the most intense. What is the number 1 grief that you are feeling for today? And I just want to acknowledge that that might bring up a lot of stuff as you do this exercise. You might feel tearful, you might feel angry, you might feel lost and confused. It might feel very fragile and vulnerable to recognize that this number 1 grief is really intense today. It also might be confusing. The thing about grief is it doesn't always go in this very neat order. So what might feel really intense today might not even be on your list tomorrow. Or it maybe didn't even come to your radar until you sat down to write this list. So whatever is your top 1 for today is just your top 1 for today. So we're not adding any judgment or criticism or any pathology to it, just acknowledging what's the one that feels most intense for today. Okay. So, second part of this exercise, which this is going to be a little bit more interactive. If people would like to put some of this stuff in the chat, it's really up to you whether or not you feel comfortable sharing. So the first part of the second part of this exercise is I want everyone to just take a moment, again, maybe 30 seconds or so, and I just want you to reflect to yourself, what about this grief feels most important or most intense for today? Maybe it's very close to an anniversary of some sort, and so this grief feels very intense today. Maybe you saw or read or heard something today that reminded you of this grief, and so it's the forefront, of your mind today. Again, we're not judging it, just acknowledging what feels like the biggest grief that is present today. If you'd like to put this in the chat, you are more than welcome to, but you're under no pressure to share anything you don't feel comfortable with. Just allow yourself a moment to reflect. What about this feels most intense and most important today? Now, in the grand scheme of life, grief doesn't just fit into a 30-second, reflection where, okay, I reflect on this. Okay, I've made sense of it. It's never really that simple. But I'm walking you through this exercise so that you can use this exercise on your own and that it's a very adaptable tool for people. So, second part of this grief, which for anyone that was in the first or second workshop, probably heard a lot about rituals and memorializing things and honoring things in a special way to acknowledge the grief. Part of what happens with cumulative grief is there's not enough space to really process and acknowledge and honor the grief that has come up because something else just, barrels down right afterwards. And so for this grief that feels most intense and most important for today, I would like for people to identify how they would like to honor and maybe even memorialize this loss and this grief. And I will give some ideas. Maybe some of these will click for you and maybe you have other ideas. So it might mean gathering some photos of this thing that you are grieving and feeling intense grief about today. It might be writing a letter to that person, place, or thing, or that grief specifically. It might be going and gathering a memento that you have that represents this grief. Maybe there is some planting of something or picking of something, of clearing out. Maybe there is a candle, a service, a prayer, a mantra, something that either maybe from a religious or spiritual perspective honors this grief. Maybe there is a financial donation or being of service to someone or something that feels connected to this grief or loss. Maybe there's something more artistic like a scrapbook, crocheting something, making some type of art. And maybe that means going to revisit a special place that is connected to that loss, listening to special music that is connected to that loss or that grief. So these are some ideas. So I want everyone to just take a moment and see if there is something that maybe resonates for you of a way in which you would like to honor and recognize and memorialize that loss for today. And if you can't, that's okay too. This is just a practice to give a tool of how this process could work. And if you'd like to put in the chat how you are going to do this or how you would like to do this, you definitely are welcome to do that. And I am looking at the chat. I just want to acknowledge that I may not be able to read every person's if tons of people start putting things in the chat, but I am going to look through it. So a few people have written about the sheer overwhelm of what it's like to experience all this grief, the death of people that have been very important to them, how oftentimes the feeling of overwhelm just leads to not being able to really function and do much, not access creativity, loss of parts of identity. So if people would like to put in the chat how they would like to consider memorializing or honoring the grief they're experiencing today, please feel free to put that in the chat. Grieving the shame of surviving while others may not be. That's a very big grief for a lot of people. So again, as you do this exercise, if there's something how you want to honor and recognize this grief, there is some type of way in which you do that, you're certainly welcome, and I invite everyone to do that. Hugging kids extra tight. That's a really lovely one. So what I'm also now going to do is do a visualization. So I'm sure some of you have heard of these things, of a visualization exercise. So what visualization is it's bringing to your mind something that, will occur in the future that you can use in order to essentially bring yourself through a process. So that doesn't always mean physically going somewhere to visualize something, but it can mean that you bring that vision to your mind in order to acknowledge it. So as you're here and you call to mind the grief that feels the most important for today, that number one grief that feels really, really high at the top of the list of all the grief you've been experiencing. And as you identify how you might like to honor or ritualize or memorialize this loss, I invite you all to see yourself holding that intense grief in one hand or on one area, and then allowing the other area of the ritual, of the memorialization of that loss, and allowing both of those things to coexist. And then whatever that tool is that you're going to use to memorialize and honor that loss, start to walk yourself through that process. So that might mean, someone mentioned wanting to hug kids a little bit tighter today, right? That might mean imagining yourself walking or moving into a room and the children are in there And you slowly approach them. And you put out your arms. And you wrap your arms around them. Maybe you say a few words, maybe you don't. And you just allow yourself in this visualization to feel whatever it is you might like to feel. Maybe that's relief. Maybe that's love. Maybe that's connection. Maybe that's even the confusion that you're experiencing about this loss, or the shame that you're feeling about this loss. But as you visualize this experience of honoring and recognizing this loss, be present to whatever feelings might be coming up. And just give yourself a moment to sit and acknowledge and be with that visualization of bringing yourself through from this very, very, very long list to a list that got a little shorter, to a little bit shorter, to really specific. And how can you honor that loss as you sit and as you visualize how to honor that loss? And again, this is just an invitation to practice with these tools today. If it doesn't feel like today's the day to do it, that's okay. The good news is you can write down these steps if you want to, or take a picture of the screen if you want to, or listen to the recording and practice another day if that feels like a possible thing for you. So the most important part of this process, I think, is the last part, number 4, practicing gentleness and compassion towards your grieving heart. Unfortunately, we often live in a society or in cultures that don't always recognize loss and grief. Sometimes they recognize it from a very quote unquote obvious perspective of if someone physically dies. But even there, in American culture, if you're a working person, you get 3 days of bereavement. 3 days. That's not how grief works. And I think everyone in here today knows that. So, practicing gentleness and compassion is really important because a lot of the outside world says, move on, get over it. It's no big deal. Just be grateful. You're fine, right? There's all these messages that people so often get that minimize and demoralize and make people feel shame and hurt about their grief. So in order to counterbalance that a little bit, it's really important that you allow yourself to feel gentle and you allow yourself to feel compassion for the grief that you're experiencing, because sometimes the world around us just doesn't give that opportunity. So I would love for people to put in the chat how they're going to just be a little bit more gentle today, a little bit more compassionate today towards their heart and soul that's grieving. Someone mentioned about the practice of gratitude, which I think is one of the greatest gifts of inviting in some gentleness and compassionate. Not everyone's in a grateful mood, and you certainly don't always have to be, but if it feels possible, the practice of gratitude can be very helpful in these experiences. So anyone that wants to offer how they're going to be a little bit more gentle, a little bit more compassionate towards themselves today. When I have really challenging sessions, or my clients have very challenging sessions, we very often identify what's one small thing you can give yourself today that just might mean you're taking care of yourself. And sometimes it's like a special drink at Starbucks. Sometimes it's just going outside and looking at the sky and just taking a deep breath. Sometimes it's, I'm going to watch a whole bunch of hours and hours and hours of Netflix. Sometimes it's, I'm going to order out some food, or I'm going to go call someone that I haven't talked to in a while. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just, how do you invite in a little bit more gentleness and a little bit more compassion to your grieving heart today? Because the reality is in 20 minutes, I just facilitated bringing up a lot of grief for all of you. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time for everyone to individually process and unpack it in a way that might be more settling for people. So number 4 is really important, because I want people to be able to allow the grief that has just come up for you to be met with a lot of gentleness for the rest of the day. So looking at a blooming flower basket, that's lovely. Comfortable shoes and clothes today, that's a great idea. 6, doing some small kind thing for someone else. Yes, being of service to other people. That's a really beautiful thing to do. Taking 6 weeks for recovery instead of the 2 weeks. Oh, that's amazing. Taking time for oneself is really, really helpful. Paint something beautiful. I love these ideas. Okay. All right, so we have a little bit more, under 15 minutes. I know people might have some questions or some comments. You can put your questions in the Q&A. If you put it in the chat, I'll do my best to track it so that I can answer some questions. But Kate also mentioned that there might even be some questions people already submitted.
Yeah, so we did have a lot of pre-submitted questions, which was fantastic. But remember, you can still submit those questions in the Q&A, like Kristy had said, at the bottom of your screen. We're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, and some questions may be similar, so I may combine them to get answers to everyone as much as possible. First I just want to say, I love the definition that you gave us about comparing cumulative grief with the waves, because I think, for me, and I hope it'll be helpful to others as well, when we be kind to ourselves and understand that, when the waves are crashing one day, maybe perhaps they'll be a little more gentle tomorrow, and using these visualization techniques, and even these techniques that you showed us. So, sometimes we have this just profound sadness and grief during the day, and perhaps we can't get to this place where we can write everything down and memorialize. Do you have any thoughts on how we can get through the day when that happens?
So yes, so the analogy I like to use for this is like, imagine your neighbor knocking on the front door, right? The grief is knocking, and you hear it knocking, like, uh-oh, I'm starting to maybe feel tears come up. I'm starting to feel angry. I'm starting to remember something about that grief experience that feels really intense for me. That's the equivalent of the neighbor knocking on the door. You might go over and look through the peephole and be like, ooh, there's some stuff out there. I'm not quite sure if I want to open the door on this right now. Maybe it's not the time. But you're not ignoring the knocking on the door. That's the most important part, is you're not ignoring that someone's knocking on the door, but you're not necessarily running over and yanking the door open, because it might not be a good time for you. However, you can maybe unlock the door, peek around and say hello to the neighbor, right? You can do that with grief. You can be like, oh, I see you're here and you're maybe coming to share some message with me. So I'm just going to peer around the corner and just ask you, like, is it something that has to happen right now? Or can we maybe like put this on hold and then I can come back to you later? So the point of that analogy is to acknowledge that it's there, but that doesn't necessarily mean you invite it in for 2 hours on your afternoon, like you would a neighbor if you're busy and you're occupied by things. So it's acknowledging that it's there and letting it know you will get back to it, but now is not the time that you can do it. And very often that seemingly simple, but can be very difficult tool, it allows you to acknowledge and accept that it's there, but it also acknowledges and accepts that I've got stuff to do, so I'm going to have to get back to you later. The key is you got to go back and look at it. You can't just close the door on it forever, because that's how it kind of builds and builds and builds and really takes a toll on people. So you do have to go back and actually open the door at some point.
Yeah, that's so true. So we have a question, and this does come up in support groups a lot. I've noticed that, um, you know, we have in we have our friends who are going through the cancer process, and some of them were sort of grieving maybe while they're still alive. You
Sure.
know, can you talk about that and how we can get through that and be there for them and ourselves as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. Grief is not something that is very simple, or it's not very tidy, and it doesn't always happen at the times that would be most beneficial, for our heart. And it can be messy, and it can be coming from a lot of different directions. So, using the tool that we use today, I actually think can be very beneficial, whether that's for yourself or maybe even doing it with a buddy or a group member. Maybe this is even a group exercise you want to bring if you're part of a support group, right? Because what it allows people to do is to recognize there is a lot of grief going on, but it also gives people kind of a bit of a container for that grief and an acknowledgement and a ritual around that grief. And so maybe it's something like, we're all just going to sit for a moment and be silent and just hold space for everyone here that might be having some feelings about their grief. Or maybe it's something like, when I used to be part of a group of professionals, we would keep a little bin of rocks and a little jar in a room that we would always kind of go back to. And anytime we had something on that felt kind of heavy on our hearts, we would pick up a rock. Sometimes we would say some things out loud to other people. Sometimes we would keep it to ourselves. And then we would just kind of sit there for however long we needed to. And then eventually we would place the rock in the jar. And that was just our acknowledgement of, I'm acknowledging this. I know that it's here, and I'm going to hand it over right now because I need to get back to living my life, doing my thing, honoring my responsibilities. So if there's some type of symbol that you can experience of acknowledging something, holding on to something, and then also letting it go. Again, the ocean is a really great analogy for that. Things come in, things go out. Things come in, things go out. But doing it at a pace that also feels reasonable for you and the people around you.
So we have a comment, and okay, so it seems like cumulative grief has left me with such emptiness inside. So when that does happen, how do you help someone um, sort of acknowledge that and move forward with that?
Mhm. Well, I think there's a lot of different approaches that could take, and I think that's more kind of it's such an open question that I don't necessarily
Yeah,
know I have
yeah.
a specific way a person should specifically do that. But I think there's kind of two things I'm thinking. One thing I'm thinking is, again, participating in some type of way that honors and recognizes that grief. Every culture and every religion does something like that. It's because it's really, really healing. And sometimes doing it in a community of other people is the most healing, but that may not always be possible. So identifying what are the rituals and what are the things that feel helpful for you in order to honor that grief. And then the second part is, what is it that I can do to take care of myself today? And maybe for this particular person, the end of that sentence is to feel less empty or to feel more fulfilled. Something maybe from childhood that you really loved to do. Maybe there's a craft, a hobby, a person, a place, something that when you think about that thing, you're like, oh, that actually does bring my heart a little bit of warmth or a little bit of joy. The goal is not that that thing is going to always sustain you. It's probably going to have to be a variety of different things. But maybe that's where it gets started, is acknowledging and honoring and ritualizing the grief, and then also making sure there's something else on the other side of that, which is, what can I do, or what would help me feel a little bit more fulfilled in my heart today? And again, something that's a really good kind of cue is like, what was something that I loved from my childhood? Maybe it was a stuffed animal. And so you're going to order that stuffed animal if you can find something like that off Amazon, right? Or maybe it was going to a particular place to get an ice cream or a treat, right? So like, be creative. It can be silly. It can seem childlike. It can seem weird, but it's okay because if it's going to make you feel a little bit more of a fullness in your heart and a little bit of warmth for that day, that's a starting point.
I love that. I love that you're acknowledging that and trying to find some joy and finding something that could make you feel a little bit better. I think that's important and not staying and not keeping the emptiness.
Because both are important, right? They're both required. There's needs to be time and space for the sorrow, the sadness, and the grief.
Yeah.
There also needs to be some time for some healing and some joy. And I'm always very hard pressed when people say to me, like, there's nothing that brings me joy. I'm like, you wouldn't be alive if there wasn't. There's gotta be something. And it might be really small and really minuscule, but there might be something. I have someone right now that I'm working with that she orders these like very colorful pens. I'm not quite sure where they're from. And she gets this beautiful stationery. She doesn't even always do something with it, but she thinks it's really beautiful and she loves to have it around. And when she sees it, she's like, oh, it's so beautiful. Gives her a little joy in her heart to have it around. So it can be really, really simple. It does not have to be a profound joy. It can be a really, really simple joy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So we have so many wonderful questions, and unfortunately, we will not have time to ask them all. So, but I think this might be important. So I want to end with this one. Do you know of any books or any other things that we that you have some resources for people um, to read about grief and work through grief?
Ooh, that's a fantastic question. I can't say that off the top of my mind that there's something that's like jumping out at me. And partly because I know a lot of books on grief often have a spiritual or religious element to them.
I see.
And so that's always something I always am very, very mindful of, is if someone does not want that as a perspective, that I don't recommend that necessarily. But I do think that oh, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I think a really good place to start is looking for some type of grief support group that's connected to that grief. Um, there are grief support groups for pet loss. There are grief support groups that may not be specific to grief, but you might be able to bring the topic of grief up. For example, if you're a person with cancer and you're in a support group and you say, hey, there's something I really want to talk about today, and that can be topic of conversation. There definitely is a lot of good stuff out there, but there's also a lot of good stuff that focuses on so many different areas. It could be related to a person with cancer, a caregiver to someone with cancer, a death from someone from cancer. It could be related to losing body parts as it relates to an illness, or losing identity as it relates to something. Grief for children. My point is there's a lot of areas, and so I don't really have a recommendation of like a one size fits all. It would probably be something that I would have to kind of customize and recommend for a person. And I know that's
Okay,
a big answer, and I'm sorry it's a big answer,
that's
but
okay.
the good news is there is a lot of resource out there on grief, thank goodness, because it's being acknowledged and discussed, but a lot of it is quite kind of specific for people's very tender and very specific grief.
Yeah, so that's understandable. Um, so yeah, I get that.
But there is stuff out there. So I do want to encourage that. My one of my go-to tools is like Google, and you put the name of the grief and then you put grief and see what happens, right? So it could be
Okay,
cancer grief, or it could be, grief of a spouse, right? Just put some keywords in Google and see what pops up. There's probably stuff for it.
okay, so that's helpful too, though. People can find what's helpful to them, and with that search. So thank you so much for that. And thank you so much, Kristy, for your thoughtful and thorough answers to these many questions we have. We'll have a recording of this program available on the website in 1 to 2 weeks. And please make sure to check out our website, the Shares website, for upcoming educational programs. We have podcast episodes and support groups. And don't forget to follow us on social media as well. This concludes the webinar. Thank you again, Kristy, and I hope that everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.